Okay, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is the first presentation involving Carl Jung on the channel in quite some time. I've been doing some Patreon interviews for Real Eyes Radio, and some of that work will come into play what we're going to discuss today. Today, we're going to be looking at Carl Jung's Bollingen stone. As you can see here on the first slide that Jordan has up on the screen, um, the background image is taken from a documentary that you can find on YouTube. Jerome Hill, a documentary filmmaker in 1951, began to create a documentary with Carl Jung at his home in Switzerland, Bollingen Tower. And the focal point of the footage that we still have is about Carl Jung creating this uh, carving on this cube of white sandstone at his home. And we're going to try to decode the markings on it. And as far as why this came to my attention, it came to my attention first because it is on the cover of the anthology of Jung's writings on astrology that is put out by Routledge Press. And through that, I found a woman named Maud Oakes, which was a patient of his, was also the cousin of Jerome Hill, who did this unfinished documentary that you can find on YouTube. And she wrote a book that was put out through the Bollingen Foundation called The Stone Speaks. And I finished it a few days ago. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to include some of her insights on the stone. So before moving on, Jordan, would you like to say something about this introductory slide?
I'm just super excited to get into it. I think this presentation could easily be 12 hours, but we're going to try to keep it as succinct as possible, but really inviting all of the viewers. If anything sparks your interest, there are very deep, deep rabbit holes you could follow yourself with any one of, I think, the images and slides that Luke has prepared.
I should uh, say this that Jordan has. I think Jordan has a lot of background in this information, but I don't think she has a strong sense of what I'll be presenting today. So a lot of this she'll be seeing for the first time, just as the audience.
That's right.
Okay, so if we can go to slide 2, just for a little background um, to discuss these images, here's a closer look at Maud Oakes' book, The Stone Speaks, the memoir of a personal transformation from the tower that I mentioned earlier. This really came to my attention via a local fixture in my hometown, the Mary and Paul Mellon. Here's a marker devoted to Mary Conover Mellon, who dedicated a great deal of her life to disseminating Carl Jung's works through the Bollingen Foundation, funded by Paul Mellon. Both Mary and Paul were acolytes of Paul Mellon. They saw him. Um, they even sat in on his Zarathustra seminar in Switzerland, which one day I hope to cover more in depth. And I found Maud via the Bollingen Foundation because she, and I'll show this in the next slide, published the very first book in the Bollingen series. We'll talk about that in slide 3. But just to get things started, Maud Oakes, in her book about the stone, reveals that Jung told her that he created the stone out of amusement, that all the symbols on it are provisional and will vary from interpreter to interpreter, but also that everything he has ever written is contained within the stone. So we are getting some mixed messages about the nature of the artifact. Today, I don't think we are going to try and solve the meaning of Jung's stone, mainly because I've yet to read everything Jung wrote. I've said this in many different presentations. I am still somewhat of a novice when it comes to Jungian thought. We can get a good start on it, however, and open many avenues of study from everything um, I've recovered so far. So it is entirely possible, nay, likely, that this topic will have to be revisited as my understanding of Jung deepens. Do you have anything to add, Jordan, before we go on to the next one?
No, I think this is a great introduction to what we're talking about. There's so many symbols within the stone itself. And I imagine later on you have a photo of the whole stone so people can really get a sense of what we're talking about exactly.
Yep, we're going to go super granular on the stone today. So that's definitely going to happen. If we can go to slide 3, I found something during the viewing of the Maud Oakes narration of the Bollingen Stone documentary that one can find on YouTube. It's I believe it's entitled C.G. Jung at Bollingen. You can see on slide 3 here, if Jordan has that up. I think she probably does. In the bottom left-hand corner, that's how you find it on YouTube. As I was watching it, this art piece jumped out at me. And I said, I've seen that before. I've seen this Navajo sand painting before. Why is this in this Bollingen Stone documentary with Maud Oakes? It's from The Shining. Or at least it's nearly identical to the sand painting that Jack throws his tennis ball against in the Overlook Hotel. And it, so that really struck me. I found out that Maud, as I mentioned earlier, published 2 books via the Bollingen Foundation. The first might be of interest one day for us because it seems plausible, given the above discovery, that she inspired the secret meaning of the Navajo sand painting in The Shining. And it's the book is called Where the Two Came to Their Father, a Navajo War Ceremonial. She did this with a shaman named Jeff King, Maud Oakes, and this is a really big deal, Joseph Campbell, before he was really on the map. It's the very first Bollingen publication, as I mentioned. She also did another one called The Two Crosses of Todos Santos, Survivals of Mayan Religious Ritual. I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to be relevant. She did that in 1951, and it was the 27th book published via the Bollingen Foundation. So one day I want to get this book because I think it will unlock the meaning of the sand painting in The Shining. Although, as I found yesterday, I finally got a hold of if you go to slide 4 here, the archetypes in the collective unconscious. I knew that I'm also working on a concurrent presentation on Jung and mandala symbolism. And I went straight to the mandala essay in this collective volume, The Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. And it's filled with images, and figures 45 and 46 are also Navajo sand paintings. I wrote this yesterday. I've not had the time to go into it yet, but one can perhaps find Jung's most direct writing on mandala symbolism in Collective Works, Volume 9, Part 1. Part 2 is Aeon, which we'll talk about today too. I'll be preparing this for a future presentation on mandala symbolism and Kubrick. What I found while perusing it is that Jung discusses Navajo paintings. I have no idea if Maud Oakes brought these to Jung's attention, vice versa, or if they both ended up studying them independently and concurrently. Given this recent discovery, it is possible that Kubrick is directing us back to this specific essay of Jung's with Jack tossing the tennis ball at the Navajo imagery in The Shining. So I don't have any sort of conclusive thoughts about what Jung says about these Navajo sand paintings, what Maud Oakes has to say about these Navajo sand paintings, but I anticipate in the future that we're going to have to delve into this. Does anything strike you about this, Jordan?
I think the only thing that you didn't touch on, and this is a whole other lane we could spend more time on, but Maud specifically was using, for my understanding, these sand paintings as a meditation tool, as a way to kind of prompt her own dialogue with her own subconscious through reflection and part of her own individuation process. I don't know if Jung interacted with these in the same way, but very similar tools to the mandalas generally, and how they're used in lots of different spiritual practices.
I think you might have a greater understanding of how Jung viewed the mandalas. I've just been trying to identify them, see them when they pop out, especially in Kubrick's works. I mean, my understanding from, which is very limited from the Navajo perspective, is that they're sort of energetic, and something is something comes through them. So, but what that something is and why it would be important to Jung and Kubrick is still mystifying to me. And why I say Kubrick is that there are several times in Kubrick's works where he makes references to mandalas and magic circles, sort of obviously. The end of Eyes Wide Shut, you see the magic circle game in the toy store. And although I've yet to snag a screenshot of this, I have some evidence that in the Torrance apartment in The Shining, one of the books that is in there that Wendy reads is the Magic Circle, which again, that's what mandala means in Sanskrit or in English, if you translate that Sanskrit word. I'm sorry. So I think it's time to get into the stone. We're gonna look. The way I have this organized on slide 5 is I have the second face first. Although it's kind of arbitrary how you get into it and what you're considering the first face and the second face. There are 3 faces. One is blank, and what we're looking at first is considered to be the second face. So let's just I found it very valuable to consult this Tumblr, Alchemist Soul. He had a succinct summary of what's on each side of the stone, and he says here, the second side of the cube depicts Jung's Telesphorus figure. You'll forgive me if I'm saying that incorrectly. Telesphorus figure, bearing a lantern and wearing a hooded cape, is surrounded by a Greek inscription, and here it is in English. Time is a child playing like a child, playing a board game, the kingdom of the child. This is Telesphorus, who roams through the dark regions of this cosmos and glows like a star out of the depths. He points the way to the gates of the sun and to the land of dreams. All right. So, also, Alchemist Soul says the second side also contains a 4-part mandala of alchemical significance. The top quarter of the mandala is dedicated to Saturn, the bottom quarter to Mars, the left quarter to Sol Jupiter, which is male, and the right quarter to Luna Venus, female. So there's a lot of spiraling we can do here. So I'm going to try to break this down little by little as we go. The first line, time is a child playing like a child, playing a board game, the kingdom of the child. That is the time as a child at play, gambling a child is the kingship, is a fragment attributed to Heraclitus. From the from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I lifted this from on Heraclitus. I had to refresh my memory about what is actually going on in the work of Heraclitus. He was a Greek philosopher of Ephesus who was active around 500 BCE. Heraclitus propounded a distinctive theory which he expressed in oracular language. He is best known for his doctrines that things are constantly changing, universal flux, that opposites coincide, the unity of opposites, and that fire is the basic material of the world. The exact interpretation of these doctrines is controversial, as is the inference often drawn from this theory that in the world as Heraclitus conceives it, contradictory propositions must be true. The fragment, this is a little bit more from the from Encyclopedia of Time, Science, Philosophy, Theology. The entries from James Burke's are edited. Time is a child playing a game of draughts. The kingship is in the hands of a child. The simile is Heraclitus's most explicit word on time, as distinct from change or universe. Time is a child playing because it plays at random, not by strategy and tactics. Hence, a child playing at draughts and would be moving the pieces without rules and only at whim. Time is the kingship at stake. Why is time a kingship? It is the very beginning of life. It's fire. Heraclitus is said to have spurned the company of adults and played games with children, but he did not romanticize youth. Rather, he only believed adulthood to be worse. In another fragment, he shed some small light onto how he envisioned children in charge of a kingship. The Ephesians would do well to hang themselves every adult man and bequeath their city state to adolescence. So time has been handed to the least capable out of default by miserable failed beings, or so it would seem if the parallels sound. How is it consistent, though, to say that time is random or worse, and yet the cosmos, which after all is only the spatial material complement to that same time, is guided by logos? This is evidently another of Heraclitus's antinomies, which will end by saying that they are both random and not random, both according with logos and not according with it. So that that gives us a little bit of an insight into what Heraclitus is talking about. We're going to go much deeper here in a moment. Um, just so in the bottom right hand corner, and I think Jordan may have read Aeon. I read it a long time ago. I don't think I really understood it, but he uses the word in Greek Aeon, which means time, but also it's relevant to Jung's work Aeon. And in this book, uh, part two in the collected works of volume 9, it's called Aeon Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. It was originally published in German in 1951 and is considered one of the major works of Jung. And just for a sense of what that's about and how it might relate to the stone, its central theme is the symbolic representation of the psychic totality through the concept of the self, whose traditional historical equivalent is the figure of Christ. Jung demonstrates his thesis by investigation of the Christian fish symbol and of Gnostic and alchemical symbolism. He regards these as phenomena of cultural assimilation. Chapters on the ego, the shadow, and the anima and animus provide a valuable summary of these elementary concepts in Jungian psychology. Much in this volume is concerned with the rise of Christianity and with the figure of Christ. Jung explores how Christianity came into being when it did, the importance of the figure of Christ, and the identification of that figure with the archetype of the self. The book also discusses the problem of opposites, particularly good and evil. And this is going to be interesting because it's not Christ as obviously it's not Christ as we understand it, but also I think there's going to be this recurring figure from Mithraism known as Aeon for Jung, which was a lion-headed snake encircled Mithraic god image of time, which was also called Deus Leontocephalus, who for Jung represented death, birth, and a psychological union of opposites like light and darkness, male and female, creation and destruction. So it's pretty deep. Let's see here. The time, if we go back to this kingdom of the child part, Maud Oakes says, when talking about this kingdom of the child, she thought on page 107, she says that in analysis, the path leads to the land of childhood, separated from the historical psyche, the collective unconscious, not only to the land where the complexes of childhood have their origin, but to a prehistoric country, which was the cradle of all our psyches. So there's something about the primordial union that this figure in the center is going to represent, who's going to dive into the collective unconscious and reemerge and perhaps transform into this Aeon figure. If we can go to the Telosphorus line, I mentioned earlier that this figure who roams through the dark regions of this cosmos and glows like a star out of the depths, Jung tells us specifically that this is from the Mithras liturgy on page 277, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And the last line, he points the way to the gates of the sun and to the land of dreams. This too is an allusion to another work. This is an allusion to the Odyssey, book 24, verse 12. It refers to Hermes, the psychopomp, who leads away the spirits of the slain suitors. So that's a lot to cover. We're going to go in, we're going to break it down a little bit more. Do you want to say anything before we dig a little deeper into the Heraclitus connection to Jung, Jordan?
Yeah, I had a few thoughts. One that just occurred to me, and maybe I'm off base, but I don't know if you're familiar with the log lady
Yeah, from Twin
in
Peaks, of course.
from Twin Peaks. I don't think in any sense Maud Oakes is the log lady, but the name Oakes and log lady, it just this connection popped in my head that perhaps there's some inspiration here. Um, but that's something I will have to spend more time considering. And thinking about Philosopherus, that as a concept, I think we could spiral on and on and on about. But just visually looking at this side of the stone, in my mind, Telosphorus is a bit of this unification of all of these aspects, like the unification of Saturn and Mars and Venus and Jupiter, the anima, the animus, the the divine child as being like closer to the divine spark. And you talked a lot with a lot of really big words how this child figure is almost more pure and more connected to divinity and doesn't yet have the psyche as online yet. And so that is what is introducing this perceived randomness in the way it explores, and like the curiosity, the pure curiosity is that's just expressed through the child, um, is kind of how I interpret what you said. It, I don't know if that is what you meant, but just trying to integrate it myself.
I am still a student. A lot of why I put this presentation together was to try to put these jigsaw pieces together. But I think that sounds mostly right. Um, but there's a
Yeah,
lot more to do. Like I said, I'll probably have to revisit this.
totally. And then, of course, I've been studying theurgy as a concept. And so that's why I'm familiar with the mythurgic liturgy. And my understanding of it is that it's really outlining this ascension process and these stages that we go through to then reunify with the Godhead, with God, with, there's all these different phrases one could use. But Telosphorus is a bit of this, maybe you're going to get into this soon, but a bit of this hermetic Hermes figure that's able to kind of move through these phases of consciousness down to the material in the earth realm and then up to the spiritual non-material of the heavens.
Yep, we're definitely getting into that.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
So if we can go to slide 6, and I thought I would just share a few quotes. I can I've updated us on what Heraclitus generally believed, but I think we should look at what Jung thought about Heraclitus. And he wrote, I think I found like 7 different quotes, but here are a few that I've included on this slide. Just as all energy proceeds from opposition, so the psyche too possesses its inner polarity, this being the indispensable prerequisite for its aliveness, as Heraclitus realized long ago. That's from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, page 346. From the collected works 7, Jung writes, Old Heraclitus, who is indeed a very great sage, discovered the most marvelous of all psychological laws, the regulative function of opposites. He called it enantiodromia, a running contrariwise, by which he meant that sooner or later everything runs into its opposite. Thus, the rational attitude of culture necessarily runs into its opposite, namely the irrational devastation of culture. We should never identify ourselves with reason, for man is not and never will be a creature of reason alone, a fact to be noted by all pedantic culture mongers. The irrational cannot be and must not be extirpated. The gods cannot and must not die. There's a lot there, but generally we're getting kind of a taste for some of Jung's metaphysics, and also that um, the concept of reality and God is going to explode the rationalistic understanding of what those things are. And the last one I included here, in the same measure as the conscious attitude may pride itself on a certain godlikeness by reason of its lofty and absolute standpoint, an unconscious attitude develops with a godlikeness oriented downwards to an archaic God whose nature is sensual and brutal. The enantiodromia of Heraclitus ensures that the time will come when this deus absconditus shall rise to the surface and press the God of our ideals to the wall. Carl Jung, Collected Works 6. So I think we need to ask ourselves what this unity of opposites is, and how it relates to Heraclitus. Uh, I just have a few passages from Wikipedia here to help us understand what's going on. Um, if I can get my computer to work. There we go. So the unity of opposites is the central category of dialectics, said to be related to the notion of non-duality in a deep sense. It defines a situation in which the existence or identity of a thing or situation depends on the coexistence of at least two conditions which are opposite to each other, yet dependent on each other and presupposing each other within a field of tension. Heraclitus, however, did not accept the Milesian monism and replaced their underlying material arc with a single divine law of the universe, which he called logos. The universe of Heraclitus is in constant change while remaining the same. That is to say, when an object moves from point A to point B, a change is created, while the underlying law remains the same. Thus, a unity of opposites is present in the universe, simultaneously containing difference and sameness. An aphorism of Heraclitus illustrates the idea as follows: the road up and the road down are the same thing. This is an example of a compressant unity of opposites, for at the same time, the slanted road has the opposite qualities of ascent and descent. According to Heraclitus, everything is in constant flux, and every changing object contains at least one pair of opposites, though not necessarily simultaneously, and every pair of opposites is contained in at least one object. Heraclitus also uses the succession of opposites as a basis for change. Cold things grow hot, hot things grow cold, a moist thing withers, a parched thing is wetted. An object persists despite opposite properties, even as it undergoes change. And what of this enantiodromia that Jung references, and how does Heraclitus come in? Well, again from Wiki, enantiodromia is a principle introduced in the West by Carl Jung. In Psychological Types, Jung defines enantiodromia as the emergence of the unconscious opposite in the course of time. It is similar to the principle of equilibrium in the natural world, in that any extreme is opposed by the system in order to restore balance. When things get to their extreme, they turn into their opposite. Jung adds that this characteristic phenomenon practically always occurs when an extreme, one-sided tendency dominates conscious life. In time, an equally powerful counterposition is built up, which first inhibits the conscious performance and subsequently breaks through the conscious control. However, in Jungian terms, a thing psychically transmogrifies into its shadow opposite in the repression of psychic forces that are thereby cathected into something powerful and threatening. Enantiodromia also refers to the process whereby one seeks out and embraces an opposing quality from within, internalizing it in a way that results in individual wholeness. This process is the crux of Jung's notion called the path of individuation. One must incorporate an opposing archetype into their psyche to obtain a state of internal completion. And that's what I have for this slide. All right. So if we go to the next one, slide 7, if you've been following along from Realize Radio, I put together this diagram that synthesized what I believed is a latent panentheism that's in Carl Jung's works, his concept of the unus mundus, what he has to say about energy, time, fate, life, synchronicity and causality, and the mind of God. I'm not going to go into this whole diagram today, but I think part of the diagram I wanted to point out is that it seems to be that Jung understands reality to be continuously created by conditions from eternity, energetic conditions from eternity. And I thought that sounded very similar to Heraclitus's idea of either the world or God being associated with fire. And at some point, I think I'll try to integrate these better. But the two fragments that I found that perhaps fit in well with this provisional diagram that I'm working on. I have one here. This world order, the same of all, no God nor man did create, but it ever was and is and will be ever living fire, kindling in measures and being quenched in measures. Notice he uses God with a small g, or at least that's how it's translated. No minor God, but this is kind of the transcendent eternal God that we're talking about, that may be this primordial fire. It's complicated. I'm some sort of Heraclitus scholar, but I think it's possible that could be what we're talking about. And another fragment here from Heraclitus. God is day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, satiety, hunger, and it alters just as when it is mixed with incense is named according to the aroma of each. So I thought that was interesting. Do you have anything to add, Jordan?
I just think this is interesting that Heraclitus is talking about God as a totality of all, compared to, I think, a lot of, at least the culture I was brought up in, viewed God more as only kind of like the good, like the light side, versus kind of talking about it being like both the light and the shadow.
Well, I have to say, this is all sort of inconclusive. As I read off earlier, there's a lot of debate over about what Heraclitus really meant. So I would say anything that I say here about what Heraclitus says God is or is not, what he's identical to, is all very tentative until I can do deeper research. So to be determined in a lot of ways.
Sure. And could you define pantheism
Uh,
for
yeah,
us?
sure. I mean, I think the idea, you know, it's better if you bring it out and contrast it to other sort of conventional ideas of what God is. It's if you think about sort of classical theism, the idea that creation is something that God is outside of, that he sets in motion, kind of a classically deist perspective, right? That perhaps he operates on his creation from time to time, but is not identical with it, versus pantheism, which God is taken to be identical with the world. Panentheism tries to sort of split the difference, where the energies of God or God himself penetrates the universe, but he is still transcended and beyond it.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's go to slide 8. Okay. So let's revisit we're still on this second side of the cube. Let's revisit this quote. This is Telesphorus, who roams through the dark regions of the cosmos and glows like a star out of the depths. Right? We said this was part of the Mithras liturgy, or Jung tells us this in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, his autobiography. So, who is Telesphorus? Um, I on the slide I included a little bit of text from Wiki. In ancient Greek religion, Telesphorus was a minor child god of healing. He was a possible son of Asclepius and frequently accompanied his sister Hygeia. He was depicted as a dwarf whose head was always covered with a cow hood or cap. Okay. Now, Maud Oakes in The Stone Speaks wrote on page 108, "You were also called the begetter and the begotten, and such were associated with the phallus, a symbol of psychic energy in its creative aspect. Their cone shaped hoods, similar to yours, are related to the Phrygian cap that had the visible power to make the wearer invisible. The last line on the central face to the stone is a quotation from Homer that points to the gates of the sun." We'll get to that in a little bit. But I think it's interesting here that Telesphorus is a phallic symbol, kind of pointing to the generative aspect, how he spurs on the path of individuation. I think that's the idea that's going on here. And that's going to necessarily require him as this mercurial figure to perhaps be a messenger between worlds, the unconscious world of the collective unconscious. And in case it was not clear, I think it has been, Telesphorus is Hermes Mercury. Jung says in the documentary that he doesn't necessarily call him God, but he calls it a familiar spirit of Asclepius, which is an interesting distinction. Um, he also says, and it's kind of cryptic, he doesn't really want to define what the stone is, largely because I think he wants each individual to have their own unique encounter with it. And like he said at the introduction, it's a lot of the symbolism is provisional. But he says, as the one points to the region of the Westland that is supposed to be the land of the dead. And I'm not exactly sure how we are to interpret that with this little statue. Um, I think the idea has something to do with, like, we have the sun and the moon there, and the sun does set in the west. So maybe it has something to do with that. But we'd have to get into all this planetary symbolism that's on the stone, which I touch on in passing today, but I wasn't quite prepared to go super deep into it. Now, the Mithras liturgy, I think so. We're talking about this mercurial figure, but we also have this Mithras connection. And I didn't know very much about Mithras. So I consulted this article by Brendan Hurd on classicalwisdom.com, The Mithras Liturgy and Carl Jung, was put out in 2019. And he writes, in 1903, Albrecht Dietrich translated the Mithras Liturgy, a Greek fragment from the Greek magical papyrus of Paris. Its subject matter is of magical incantations, but with reference to Mithraic cosmography. The text is thought to date to the 4th century AD, though Dietrich proposed a much earlier date. The liturgy details an initiation ceremony intended to invoke Helios Mithras in order to ultimately reveal to the initiate secrets of immortality, attaining the high celestial realm. It is even titled Ritual for Immortalization. This is interesting that Jung is preoccupying himself with initiation rituals for Mithraism. We'll get to that in a second. But what is Mithraism? Mithraism, also known as the Mithraic Mysteries or the Cult of Mithras, was a Roman mystery religion centered on the god Mithras. Although inspired by Iranian worship of the Zoroastrian divinity Mithra, the Roman Mithras was linked to a new and distinctive imagery, and the level of continuity between Persian and Greco-Roman practice remains debatable. The mysteries were popular among the Imperial Roman army from the 1st to the 4th century CE. And if you look here, I've included an image of Jung's book, History of Modern Psychology Lectures, delivered at ETH Zurich, Volume 1, 1933 to 34. This is where one can find Carl Jung on the sun vision and the Mithras liturgy. It's lecture 9, 28th of June, 1935. And one little sample of it is how it starts. We ended the last lecture by reading part of the sun vision in the Mithraic liturgy. We heard the invocation of the god recorded in light and fire symbols. This sun motif appears in many places and times, and the meaning is always the same, that a new consciousness has been born. It is the light of illumination which is projected into space. This is a psychological event. The medical term hallucination makes no sense in psychology. So it's not so much immortality that Jung is talking about here, but the birth of a new consciousness. And how do these pieces fit together? It appears that the figure of Telesphorus is a mercurial messenger that is moving the process of individuation forward and the transformation of us into new kinds of beings, which leads to a critic of Jung's that I've discovered in this process named Richard Knoll. And if we look at the background image of this slide, here's one of Knoll's books, The Aryan Christ, The Secret Life of Carl Jung, and an image of Aeon that appears in the frontispiece of the Aeon text that we mentioned earlier, of a god being with a lion head and a snake wrapped around him. We learn from this. Knoll, in an interview called "The Mysterious Jung: His Cult Lies He Told and a Cult." This is an opponent of Jung's. He's trying to offer some balance here. Knoll says this in the interview. Well, Jung certainly believed Mithraism was Christianity's great rival religion, but in fact, some of the other cults like Dionysus were more widespread at the time. But anyway, during 1913 and 1914, Jung withdrew from his former bourgeois lifestyle and lived out a wild, intense, mad fantasy life, during which he believed he was initiated. He descended into a cave and had all sorts of strange dreams and fantasies, which he describes in his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in the chapter Confrontation with the Unconscious. But that book has it in only the watered-down version of what happened. What's missing is the culmination of the whole series of visions that I describe in the Jung cult. That's when Jung, standing with his arms outstretched like the crucified Christ, a big snake wrapped around his body, suddenly turns into a god. He develops a lion head, becoming the lion-headed god of the ancient Mithraic religion, a mixture of Mithraic Aeon and Christ. This initiation was particularly significant for Jung. So I think that is important context. Now, I'm still learning a lot about this. is are these objections true that Jung created some sort of cult based upon this admixture of Mithraic mysteries, or was he just playing with it alchemically and symbolically? I think Noel believes there was an effort by his close circle to make sure that we conclude the latter. So there's probably a lot to react to here, Jordan, if you'd like to.
Oh my goodness. I think we all have a lot more reading to do. I do find though it interesting to consider just knowing the Red Book, um, how much of this he was putting into practice himself and how that might have influenced the markings on the stone. Um, yeah, I don't know. There's like way more questions here than I have any commentary to add, but I really appreciate that you brought in a critic of Jung to kind of help us have a balanced approach to it. And I mean, we could just focus on this picture of the snake wrapped around the man with the lion's head. You have kind of, it almost looks like a headstone behind him.
Mm,
We have a lot of Hermes imagery in here. There's a lot going on in that picture.
there certainly is. There certainly is.
And obviously I just think a lot of other people are probably listening to you and thinking about, we could really focus on what is the Christ in this context. There's a lot of imagery of the sun, and the lion is representative often of the sun as well. We have the writing on the stone talking about, I believe, like reaching the gate of the sun. So there's all of this emphasis around seemingly becoming the Christ consciousness, whatever that may mean to Jung. I'm not totally sure. I have my own thoughts about what that might mean.
Yeah, I wish I could say more about it. They haven't got the books haven't arrived from Amazon yet, so I I do have a copy of his Sun Vision lecture coming, and I'll probably have to do a presentation on that alone to tell you more about it.
Is there anything else Noel said that we really ought to know, whether it relates to the stone or not? Is there any major theme that you think would be important for anyone who's studying Jung?
That's really all I know at the moment. I mean, that's a pretty significant. I mean, those are huge claims, right? I mean
Yeah.
that alone is a big claim to say that he created this admixture of alchemy, Mithraism, psychology, and developed this. The charges, right, that a lot of his followers, who are very serious Jungians in their own right, like Marine von Franz and others, are going to be cult members, and I don't even know what that means, and that all the licensed Jungian analysts are somehow part of this cult. We don't. I don't have. I'd have to read his book. I have to. Those are pretty big charges. Like, what is a cult? Uh, I don't know. I don't know. I'll probably read it just to hear a dissenting point of view, because if it is a cult, I don't want to get sucked into it.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
that's how you know you're not in a cult, I guess, if you're not afraid to consider criticism. Okay. Um, let's look at slide 9. I just thought that was just interesting when I found out about Jung talking about Mithraism, and found out that Mithraism is like a subset of Zoroastrianism, that Mithras is like a god in Zoroastrianism, but then it kind of broke away and became its own thing with its new imagery. Like the inspiration for taking a closer look at this stone is that I'm really interested in trying to figure out um, why Kubrick is hinting at Carl Jung throughout his works, and why he attaches Jungian concepts to the monolith, and really developing what those may mean. You know, at the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey, when the monolith is encountered, Kubrick plays Strauss's "Thus Spake Zarathustra." That's a really big deal, and that's going to call to mind. Clearly, that's going to call to mind "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" by Friedrich Nietzsche, which Strauss got the title of the piece from. And as I mentioned earlier, Mary and Paul Mellon attended Jung's seminar on Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. So we have quite the fractal here. I think something bigger is being communicated. Um, and I'll have,
I'd like to interject a
sure.
moment because I'm not sure our viewers remember or if we stated super clearly that the melons really are connected to Maud Oakes as well as Joseph Campbell. I mean, you could explain this, but I think it's
Yeah,
worth.
I'll say it again. I mean, the Melons were personally sought out the counsel and analysis of Carl Jung. And I mean, I don't know the entire timeline, but at some point they decided that they were going to disseminate the works of Carl Jung and like minded individuals into English. And they created the Bollingen Foundation that takes its name from Bollingen Tower, where Carl Jung lived, worked, studied, and he built that tower by himself. Not well, he had a lot of stonemasons and whatnot help him do it. I shouldn't say by himself, but he worked on that. He built that with his own hands. And this is also the place of the stone that we're discussing today. And the Bollingen Foundation, in addition to putting out the collected works of Carl Jung, also put out the works of Maud Oakes and Joseph Campbell and Eric von Neumann and a variety of other individuals who I don't know off the top of my head. So that's how this all comes together. I don't know what their relationship was like with Maud Oakes interpersonally. I suspect it was a good one if they were willing, at least initially, if they were willing to make her the very first publication that they put out through her foundation. And if you followed some of the work I've done on other platforms, I looked into how Mary Conover died. She died suddenly at 41 years of age. I believe she died in 1946. And Paul kept the Bollingen Foundation going into the late 60s, I believe, sort of in being indebted to the life's work of Mary. And I think after that point, many of the texts that were published through Bollingen were absorbed into Princeton University Press. But there are probably some other subset presses that did it as well. But I do not know what the personal relationship was like between between the Mellons and Maud Oakes outside of the professional one. Did that do it?
Yeah, that might be more info than I needed. But yeah, I just wanted to make
Okay,
sure we
sure.
were kind of tying that
Yeah,
in. Why they're here and why they're
yeah.
important. It's really why anyone in the English speaking world probably has access to any of Jung's
Mm-hmm.
works.
All right, let's go to. Let's see here. Let's go to slide 10. We're still on this aspect of the stone on the second side, and in the documentary of the Bollingen Stone, Jung talks about three lightnings and one river being four parts. He says it's the ancient idea of paradise with four rivers, and he says old alchemistic secret Axio Maria. And I was like, what the heck is he talking about? And it's the subtitles aren't great, I was able to see that this Axio Maria comes from Maria, the prophetess of Judaica, or Mary the Jewess. He says, and I was like, okay. And he says, from one comes two, two, three, and from the third comes the fourth. And he talked about the planets a little bit and how they divide it into four, which he also calls a tetrameria. That I think that comes up in psychology and alchemy somewhere. I don't know. But just let's get our minds around this Axio Maria and who Mary the Jewess was. Um, so let's look at this image of we're on slide 10. I think you probably have this up, but from Wikipedia, Mary or Maria the Jewess, also known as Mary the Prophetess or Maria the Copt, was an early alchemist known from the works of Zosimos of Panopolis and other authors in the Greek alchemical tradition. On the basis of Zosimos's comments, she lived between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD in Alexandria. French Taylor and Lippmann list her as one of the first alchemical writers, dating her works at no later than the 1st century. She is credited with the invention of several kinds of chemical apparatus and is considered to be the first true alchemist of the Western world. Apparently, we still use at least three of her inventions in the laboratory today, which is wild. And she had a connection to Democritus, who many may know as this ancient Greek pre Socratic philosopher from Abdera, primarily remembered today for his formulation of an atomic theory of the universe. Democritus wrote extensively on a wide variety of topics. George Syncellus, a Byzantine chronicler of the 8th century, presented Mary as a teacher of Democritus, whom she had met in Memphis, Egypt, during the time of Pericles. This is disputed. I'm not exactly sure if the dates add up, but this woman that Jung is talking about may be responsible for communicating the idea of the atom to Democritus. This is someone that we do not know about in terms of her equipment and who she was in the history of philosophy and how she's like the first alchemist and she's a woman and all like this is a big deal. Um, and we should just to revisit the axiom of Maria is a precept in alchemy. One becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the fourth. Uh, Jung used the axiom, this is from Wikipedia, used the axiom as a metaphor for the process of individuation. One is unconscious wholeness, two is the conflict of opposites, three points to a potential resolution, the third is the transcendent function, described as a psychic function that arises from the tension between consciousness and the unconscious and supports their union. And the one as the fourth is a transformed state of consciousness, relatively whole and at peace. Jung speaks of the axiom of Maria as running in various forms through the whole of alchemy like a leitmotif. In Psychology of the Transference, he writes of the fourfold nature of the transforming process using the language of Greek alchemy. It begins with the four separate elements, the state of chaos, and ascends by degrees to the three manifestations of Mercurius in the inorganic, organic, and spiritual worlds. And after attaining the form of Sol and Luna, i.e., the precious metals gold and silver, but also the radiance of the gods who can overcome the strife of the elements by love, it culminates in the one and indivisible, incorruptible, ethereal, eternal nature of the anima, the quinta essentia, aqua permanens, tincture, or Lapis Philosophorum. This progression from the number 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 is the axiom of Maria. And if you look here, he talks about the Garden of Eden with the four rivers, how this was kind of portrayed in alchemical woodcuts. I actually found one here. This is a figure. I got this from Quadriform is Ratio. A figure of the creation of the world in four stages was also given by Barbara Obrist in a discussion of Constantina Pisa's Book of the Secrets of Alchemy. The illustration from the Libra Secretorum Alchemy is reproduced here as figure 281. The picture indicated four circles pointing to four distinct stages in the process of creation. It described in alchemical terms the great work, the magnum opus, by the flow of holy or mercurial waters. The course of the water is significant in the various stages, from the primary four to a two-division Adam and Eve, a four-division, the rivers of paradise, and a triangle. So clearly, there's a that you think you're just looking at this silly little hieroglyphic stone, but Jung was not BSing when he said, pretty much everything I wrote is here on the stone in visual form. Anything jump out to you?
This seems like the basis, this axiom of Maria feels like the basis of a lot of numerology and kind of the inherent meanings, if one wants to take on that framework, the inherent meaning of one, two, three, and four. Like in numerology, four is often like a stable number, even thinking about like a table has like four legs. um, that's where mind starts to go, and then also it connects into the mandalas. The mandalas really start typically with the four gates, a division of four, which overlays with so many different frameworks throughout different cultures, everything from the four elements, and that even ties into Carl Jung's psychological types, which he maps to the elements, but also maps to this like quadrant that then unified kind of is the whole. I just think we could spiral on and on and on just within the Axioma Maria and all of the applications you could have with it.
Yeah. Um, I think I think um, I think Jung's work on the numinous numbers is going to become relevant to this. Like you mentioned, how is playing a part. I think when I get to that, I think that would be worthwhile. You know what's interesting? Can I put something in the chat that you can bring up? I want to remember this.
Yeah.
I'm gonna. Can you click on that and click on one of the images so that we can all see it?
Yes. One moment.
What I'm sending Jordan here, my interest in this, it just came to me, is in trying to understand the meaning of the monolith in 2001. And on Jung's stone, we see the sun and the moon, and we see a crescent moon. And what's interesting is that when Thus Spake Zarathustra is playing, we see the sun and crescent moon above the monolith in 2001. And I think this might be a potential reference to the stone. I think Jordan's got the Google page up here, but
Yes.
I, that's satisfactory. I was just hoping to get a closer look at one of the particular images. There we go. There we go. So we have the full sun and the crescent moon. I'm now very curious to think this seems very matchy. Of course, we don't have any of the other planets in here, but we do have Jupiter and Saturn as part as of the 2001 story. So that'll be interesting. I'll have to remind myself to put this in my slides later. Okay. Um, let's go to slide 11. So I thought this was interesting. Um, writes or Maud says in The Stone Speaks, Jung once told me that the mandala that he carved on the stone was the eye of a fish, and that in the small circle one can see his own reflection. In his autobiography, Jung says, I began to see on the front face a small circle, a sort of eye which looked at me. I chiseled it into the stone, and in the center made a tiny homunculus. This corresponds to the little doll, pupilla yourself, which you see in the pupil of another's eye, a kind of Kabir or the telesphorus of Asclepios. So I thought that was interesting that, I mean, there's just so many layers to the stone. It never would have occurred to me had Maud not recorded this exchange with, or what Jung said about it in Memory Streams and Reflections, that it was like looking in the eye of somebody and seeing yourself, and it's a fish eye. And that immediately, because I'm working on this other presentation on mandalas and Kubrick, and I think Hal is a type of mandala. He's circular, but it got me thinking about when he asks Dave to show him his rendering. You see this little man in the center of Hal's fisheye, uh, who's asleep with the minotaur horns here. So you've got this combination of man and bull, and I wonder if that is a reference to the stone. It could be a little bit of a reach, but it also feels kind of right to me. It kind of intuitively feels good.
Yeah, I mean, it just literally looks like an eye, the stone itself, with the pupil in the middle. And then it just makes me think of iridology, the discipline that's based off of everything is basically deposited in the eye, and you can understand what's going on holistically in somebody's body just based on the visuals around the pupil. And then there's also kind of these legends that when people reincarnate, the way that you can tell people is through their eyes, and the way that you can like get a sense for people's divinity and connection to that is through the eyes as well. But then, the more commonplace statement of, eyes being the window of the soul. But it's very interesting, this idea of seeing yourself even through the eye of another reflected back to you. And I'm not sure if later you have a picture of Hal, but the photo of Hal kind of has that reflection built into it also.
Yep.
Maybe that's where you're going.
Not in this presentation, but you're totally right. Um, yeah. In the next presentation, yes, when I do the mandala symbolism, definitely
Yeah.
for sure. Okay. So if we can go to slide 12, uh, so now we're at the third sentence of the second side of the stone. He points the way to the gates of the sun and to the land of dreams. And we mentioned earlier that this Jung tells us that this is a quote from the Odyssey, book 24, verse 12. It refers to Hermes, the psychopomp, who leads away the spirits of the slain suitors. I actually found the passage. I thought I'll just read it here from the Odyssey. And by the way, I think this is incredible. Like this photo, I forget where I found this in one of my books because I've clearly taken the picture off center. This is a bust of Homer in Jung's personal library. So, I'm interested in this, that Jung wrote about Homer or alluded to Homer. How much did that inspire Kubrick when he uh, clearly channeled elements of the Odyssey into 2001: A Space Odyssey? It reads, meanwhile, Selenian Hermes called for the spirits of the wooers. He had in his hands his wand, a fair wand of gold, wherewith he lulls to sleep the eyes of whom he will, while others again he wakens even out of slumber. With this he roused and led the spirits, and they followed gibbering. And as in the innermost recess of wondrous cave bats flit about gibbering when one has fallen from off the rock from the chain in which they cling to one another. So these went with him gibbering, and Hermes, the helper, led them down the dank ways, past the streams of Oceanus. They went past the rock Lucas, past the gates of the sun in the land of dreams, and quickly came to the mead of asphodel, where the spirits dwell, phantoms of men who have done with toils. Um, I just thought this was great that Hermes has the ability to awaken certain people from the underworld. I think that's really intriguing. I think it's really intriguing. This kind of speaks to how the unconscious will have its way if you become too unbalanced. There's this other factor that will come and drive this play of opposites within us. Maud Oakes had to say this on page 111 of The Stone Speaks. When Jung talks of the hermaphroditic aspect of the child, he says, as civilization develops, the bisexual primary being turns into a symbol of the unity of the personality, a symbol of the self where the war of opposites finds peace. In this way, the primary being becomes the distant goal of man's self development, having been from the very beginning a projection of unconscious wholeness. So I think that's kind of interesting that Telesphorus would be represented as a child. Um, it's kind of this very subliminal um, uh, uh, encoded way to talk about you not being differentiated yet, right? There's sort of like a primary interconnectedness that is then going to get split up and then has to be returned into something better and unified and whole. What say you, Jordan?
Oh man, that's an interesting concept just
Yeah.
alone. And I think that's what I was getting at as Telosphorus, as the unity of male and female. Um, but yeah, it makes me. I just have lots of
Yeah.
questions. Is God like a unified energy of both male and female? Is like male and female something just inherent to this earthly experience? Um, I think with anything I have to say is probably getting off script of the text and getting more into bigger questions of cosmology and how do spirits operate. How do we operate on different planes? I have lots of questions that we probably can't answer.
I certainly don't know. I certainly don't know. And this is, Jung kind of talks out of both sides of his mouth. I don't think he makes metaphysical claims, but then at the same time, he seems to uh, be quite be quite okay handling them. So we'll see. We'll see. A
Yeah.
lot of that might be
Yeah.
that. A lot of that might come from his desire to retain credibility and not be seen as something outside of his scientific training. But at some point, I think he stops caring.
Yeah, I think that becomes more clear too when we dig into the texts that obviously inspired him. The more we dig into more ancient Greece philosophy, they have some wild ideas about what the soul is, even what gender is, that Jung obviously seems to be clued in on. But I really can't yet pin down what he totally thinks about these concepts. But he's bringing in these myths, these illusions that make me wonder, like, at minimum, he was curious about these ideas.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, let's go to slide 13. This is the last one on the second side of the stone. Uh, let's see. In This is just a little bit more about Mercurius, Telasphros. In alchemical studies, Jung thus summarizes the role of Mercurius. Some of this should sound familiar given what we've talked about so far, but I think we'll have some new aspects of Mercury here. The multiple aspects of Mercurius may be summarized as follows. One, Mercurius consists of all conceivable opposites. He is thus quite obviously a duality, but is named a unity in spite of the fact that his innumerable inner contradictions can dramatically fly apart into an equal number of disparate and apparently independent figures. Two, he is both material and spiritual. Three, he is the process by which the lower and material is transformed into the higher and spiritual, and vice versa. Four, he is the devil, a redeeming psychopomp, an evasive trickster, and God's reflection in physical nature. So you can see why this would drive a lot of people um, bonkers when Jung talks about Christianity the way that he does. Five, he is also the reflection of a mystical experience of the artifacts that coincides with the opus alchemicum. Six, as such, he represents on the one hand the self, and on the other the individuation process, and because of the limitless number of his names, also the collective unconscious. That's what he says. I'm not going to go into a big breakdown of it, but I just wanted to add a little bit more clarity there. Maud Oakes has this to say on page 126. Speaking of Mercury, Jung says that the seven planets are the seven metals contained in Mercury, for he is the father of metals. When personified, he is the unity of the seven planets, and Anthropos, whose body is the world. He also says the idea of an ascent through the seven spheres of the planets symbolizes the return of the soul to the sun god from whom it originated. Well, that's a big deal. We see that there are seven traditional planets on the stone face here. We have Mercury with his sign, or Telesphorus with his sign. We have Saturn, that's two. We have Jupiter. We have Venus. We have Mars, and then we have the sun and the moon. So that's seven. And so, like, the totality of it seems to be connected to Mercury. And this idea of ascending these spheres is going to be interesting and connected to the sun god, which I think is going to get into the allusion to the Mithras liturgy, to this god-headed, or this lion-headed god snake wrapped figure that Jung saw to himself in his active imagination. Maud Oakes also pointed out that to the alchemist, Mercurius was associated with the transforming substance quicksilver. That would make sense, and would make sense that Mercury is capable of uniting the opposites within oneself, given that tradition. So I figured there might be something in here that would resonate with you, given the planetary ruminations from Maud Oakes.
Oh, so much. But the thing that's on the forefront is some interpret the spheres of the planets really to be a map of the zones of consciousness and not necessarily how we contemporarily view the planets and space to be, but rather almost these dimensions that one's consciousness can flow through. And as you flow through each zone, it requires a releasing of different vices. So by the time you get to the gate of the sun and the land of the dreams, you no longer are holding on to the distortions or the I think that's probably the best word of it, the distortions that can come with the material experience. But this is different than, I think, a consciousness that never individuated. You said something about this earlier, but we kind of individuate in this framework. And I'm not saying, Luke, that you're making an argument here, but what I kind of hear is, we individuate to go through all these zones to then return again to the one as something greater than we were before we began. And this Hermes figure is really the archetype of like the self that's able to go through this process. And it's very paradoxical, which is really fun, like containing all of these things, but also having all of these names, but at the same time being unified, but at the same time, at any moment, we can almost drop out of this alchemical like process and go back to the individual. But those are my very quarter-baked reactions.
I think they are valuable. I think they are valuable. We are finally ready to move on to another side of the stone. We got about 20 minutes here to do the last 5 slides. So let's take a look at this. The third side of the cube is the side that faces the lake. It bears a Latin inscription of sayings which Jung says are more or less quotations from alchemy. Let me read it. I am an orphan alone. Nevertheless, I am found everywhere. I am one, but opposed to myself. I am youth and old man at one and the same time. I have known neither father nor mother because I've had to be fetched out of the deep like a fish or fell like a white stone from heaven. In woods and mountains I roam, but I am hidden in the innermost soul of man. I am mortal for everyone, yet I am not touched by the cycle of time. We to elucidate this, I brought in some quotes of Jung's. These scattered sayings from alchemy. I found 2 quotes that are relevant. I got this from the JungianTimes.com. This guy did a great job kind of creating a hypertext on the stone. But in the first one's going to come from the Collective Works 14. The second one's going to come from there as well. The orphan as the philosopher's stone. The stone was called orphan because of its uniqueness. It was never seen elsewhere, and it was said to be in the emperor's crown. It was wine-colored and sometimes shone in the night, but nowadays it does not shine anymore in the darkness. As Albertus Magnus was an authority on alchemy, he may have been the direct source both for Dorn and for Petrus Bonus. Orphan as the name of a gem may therefore mean something like the modern solitaire, a very apt name for the unique Lapis Philosophorum. Apart from Dorn and Petrus Bonus, it seems that this name is found only in the Carmina Heliodori. There it refers to the homeless orphan who is slain at the beginning of the work for purposes of transformation. All these synonyms allude to the virginal or maternal quality of the prima materia, which exists without a man and yet is the matter of all things. Above all, the prima materia is the mother of the lapis, the Filius Philosophorum. Michael Mayer mentions the treatise of an anonymous author, Delphinus, which he dates to sometime before 1447. He stresses that this author insisted particularly on the mother-son incest. And then further, our starting point for these remarks was the designation of the lapis as orphan, which Dorn mentions apparently out of the blue when discussing the union of opposites. The material we have adduced shows that what an archetypal drama of death and rebirth lies hidden in the conjunctio, and what immemorial human emotions clash together in this problem. It is the moral task of alchemy to bring the feminine maternal background of the masculine psyche seething with passions into harmony with the principle of the spirit. Truly a labor of Hercules. And if you see this book here in the bottom left-hand corner, Mysterium Conjunctionis. This is where you can find Jung's musings on the orphan and the philosopher's stone. Should we proceed to the next slide, or do you want to say something about this, Jordan?
Let's keep going.
Okay. So the next slide's a little bit easier. Um, primarily, this is, I guess, technically the first slide, or the first side of the stone. It reads, "Here stands the mean, uncomely stone, 'tis very cheap in price. The more it is despised by fools, the more loved by the wise." In fact, Jung says that's the first thing he thought of when he saw it. It's kind of ironic because the stone came to him by accident. The builders that were helping him with his tower, I guess, the quarry sent the wrong stone, and they were going to send it back. And Jung sensed the irony, and he's like, "No, no, no! I will hold on to the stone," which is a reference, to Christ being the stone that the builders rejected. And there's this whole thing about Christ being the philosopher's stone. I talked about that in my last Realize Radio presentation, but he's clearly drawing on that with this, but other traditions as well. And he says a dedication is also inscribed on the side of the stone, which reads, it's in Latin, but it reads, "In memory of his 75th birthday, C.G. Jung, out of gratitude, made and set up in the year 1950. So Jung believed that this phrase, "Here stands the mean, uncomely stone," that this was written by Arnaud de Villanova. Wikipedia says something a little bit different. Many alchemical writings, including the Rosarium Philosophorum, Novum Lumen, or Philosophorum, are also ascribed to him, but they are not authentic. Collected editions of them were published at Lyon in 1504 and 1532, at Basel in 1585, and at Lyon in 1686. He is also the reputed author of important medical works such as Speculum Medicinæ and Regimen Sanitatis and Regim Aragonum, but many others such as Breviarium Practicae were falsely attributed to him. In addition, he wrote many theological works for the Reformation of Christianity in Latin and in Catalan, some of them including apocalyptical prophecies. There's this Arnaud de Villanova character, which, if we can go to the next slide, slide 16. Villanova, by Jung, is associated with this line to have written the Rosarium Philosophorum. So I didn't know what the heck the Rosarium Philosophorum is, so I brought this in from Wiki. The Rosary of the Philosophers is a 16th century alchemical treatise. It was published in 1550 as part 2 of De Alchemia Opuscula, Complura Veterum Philosophorum. The term rosary in the title is unrelated to the Catholic prayer beads. It refers to a rose garden, metaphoric of an anthology or collection of wise sayings. The 1550 print includes a series of 20 woodcuts with German language captions, plus a title page showing a group of philosophers disputing about the production of the Lapis Philosophorum. Some of the woodcut images have precedence in earlier 15th century German alchemical literature, especially in the Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit, which has the direct precedence of woodcuts 10, 17, and 19, allegorical of the complete hierosgamos in the form of the Hermetic Androgen, and in terms of Christian iconography showing Mary flanked by the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, so Jung, from what I understand, gave a lecture or wrote on the first half of these woodcuts in this book here in the bottom left-hand corner called The Psychology of the Transference, which is an account of Jung's handling of the transference between psychologist and patient in the light of his conception of the archetypes. This can be found in the larger volume, which I have coming in the mail, of The Practice of Psychotherapy. So it's volume 16, I think. So if one wants to go deeper into it, I don't have much more to offer besides that, except here you go. This is where that saying comes from, and I'm sure he goes into much greater depth, and I will update this in a part 2 at some point. So yeah, we got 3 slides to go. Anything to say, Jordan?
I'm just super excited to get deeper into the imagery here. I think one could just meditate on this and maybe come to their own almost channeled conclusions about what's going on here. But it will be fun to revisit with what Jung has to say about it. I mean, we see the sun in here in quite interesting ways.
Yeah. 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 Uh, like Young said about the stone, I think it's for each person to kind of deal with, but I can't say for certain until I've read this book. So, uh, part of the part of the interesting thing about Young setting this up for his 75th birthday, what's interesting to me is that this brings it back to Stanley Kubrick, which got me down this path, is that uh, calendrically, July 26th seems to be one of these very energetically charged days, and Kubrick and Jung share this birthday along with a lot of other significant figures that seem to be parts of some sort of matrix puzzle. So I just wanted to bring that to this audience's attention if they were not already aware of that. And lastly, we're talking about the unfinished side of the stone. Jung wanted to put Merlin on the unfinished side. He talks about this in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I'm just going to read it. The stone stands outside the tower and is like an explanation of it. It is a manifestation of the occupant, but one which remains incomprehensible to others. Do you know what I wanted to chisel into the back face of the stone? Les Cris de Merlin. For what the stone expressed reminded me of Merlin's life in the forest after he had vanished from the world. Men still hear his cries, so the legend runs, but they cannot understand or interpret them. Merlin represents an attempt by the medieval unconscious to create a parallel figure to Parsifal. Parsifal is a Christian hero, and Merlin, son of the devil and a pure virgin, is his dark brother. In the 12th century, when the legend arose, there were as yet no premises by which the intrinsic meaning could be understood. Hence, he ended in exile, and hence Les Cris de Merlin, which still sounded from the forest after his death. This cry that no one could understand implies that he lives on in unredeemed form. His story is not yet finished, and he still walks abroad. It might be said that the secret of Merlin was carried on by alchemy, primarily in the figure of Mercurius. Then Merlin was taken up again in my psychology of the unconscious and remains uncomprehended to this day. That is because most people find it quite beyond them to live on close terms with the unconscious. Again and again, I have had to learn how hard this is for people. So we see this connection between Merlin, Telesphorus, Mercurius. Uh, there's a lot to go into here. Again, there's association with the devil and the trickster figure. And just for reference, if you weren't, I had to look this up. Who Parsifal was is a medieval chivalric romance by the poet and knight Wolfram von Eschenbach in Middle High German. The poem, commonly dated to the first quarter of the 13th century, centers on Arthurian hero Percival in English, and his long quest for the Holy Grail following his initial failure to achieve it. That's from Wiki. And to close it out, we're a little ahead of schedule. I have this quote from Marie-Louise von Franz from Archetypal Dimensions about Merlin. Merlin has a strangely ambiguous third nature. He is usually good, but sometimes also a trickster and a rather shadowy figure. He is nearly immortal, for it is said he will not die before the end of this world. In Jungian terms, he represents the natural whole man, good and evil, mortal and immortal, a symbol of the human psychic totality which Jung terms the self. It's pretty heavy, considering he also associates him with the devil, and that somehow this is going to be part of the psychic totality. I'm refraining from making judgments on this since I'm still learning, but that is my initial gloss of Jung's Bollingen stone and some inroads into the monolith in 2001.
Thanks so much, Luke. There's so much here for us all to dive deeper into. I think it's just so crazy. Like, obviously, Young was very taken by everything we touched on, and probably there's even more concepts that we're still like parsing out of what is in the stone. But for a man to carve this by hand with a chisel To me, it demonstrates quite a big commitment to these concepts and ideas.
Yeah. I I don't know what to say. I mean, he says like, "Oh, it just sort of happened spontaneously and he did it to amuse himself." But how much he deposited on that stone, and I think I've gotten most of it, but it's clearly incomplete. I've made it very clear throughout this presentation of what I don't know, and what I've not had time. I mean, even just putting this together, we're running up an hour and a half. Um, I'm probably gonna have to do another one of these just to capture what I left on the table.
For sure.
Well, I've said everything I've wanted to say. Do you want to close us out, or are you done?
I'm just struck by the amount of rich illusions tied in there. I think it's really interesting that he did this towards the end of his life, and this almost feels like a culmination of his studies throughout his lifetime and almost a synthesis. Even if it was an unconscious kind of not super methodical way to pass the time, I still think it's really fascinating what has percolated for Jung on his 70th birthday, and what made it onto the stone is clearly, I think, a place to really focus on. He has so much work, so much to read, but it seems to me this alchemical process is a really key part of it. And I also think back on psychological types and all of these other aspects that seem a little less cosmological. And it's making me really think about those more like mundane topics in a really different lens, and really viewing them more as a component of this larger metaphysics, even if Jung isn't going to explicitly claim a metaphysical framework. That's really it. I have more questions than comments on this topic.
Well, send. I would just say, anyone who watched this, leave your comments and your questions, and I'll try to follow this up in a part two.
Great. Well, thanks so
All right.
much,
Thank
Luke.
you, Jordan.